Joining us right here in the studio, Dr. Einat Wilf. She's a former member of Israeli parliament in the Labour Party and author of The War of Return. Also with us, Ashraf Al-Ajrami, a former Minister of Detainee Affairs in the Palestinian Authority. Thank you both very much for being here. We just heard from Owen some of the basic arguments on both sides. Einat, let me start with you. The argument that this is a critical organization for essentially keeping the peace, not just education, but actually the peace in Gaza and the West Bank. Your take on the Trump administration deciding to cut all U.S. funds?
It's actually precisely the opposite. This organization is the most radicalizing element among the Palestinians because it keeps alive the delusion that Israel is temporary and that Palestinians can realistically expect that one day they will take over Israel, turning the Jews into a minority in an Arab country and having an Arab Palestine from the river to the sea. When Palestinians want that, it's one thing. But when they see an organization that has the letters UN in it, that gets money from the US, from Europe, from Canada, from Australia, they tell themselves, this is not just my own dream or my own desire to take back Palestine from the river to the sea. This is a legitimate right supported by the international community. And that's the problem, because this gives fuel to a demand that at its basis is illegitimate, because it's a demand that says the war is not over. We still expect to undo the state of Israel, to turn the Jews back into a minority, and rather than the world telling them, look, we will support you if you want a state for yourself in the West Bank and Gaza. But if you continue to be attached to this idea that you have a right to settle into Israel, sovereign Israel, with the pre-67 lines, if you think that's a legitimate demand, we want you to know that it's not, and that the world is not with you. We will be with you if you want a state in the West Bank and Gaza. We will not be with you if you want to settle and take over Israel itself.
Ashraf, I want you to answer some of Einat's point, but also just address the question, wouldn't it even be better for the money to go directly to the Palestinian Authority to distribute, or another UN agency?
You know, first of all, the Palestinian issue is a unique issue. We are speaking about refugees without its own state. We aren't speaking about refugees, for example, from recognized state like Syria and other Iraq and other places. We are speaking about people without state. Because of that, the main issue for the Palestinians is the refugees issue. Because of that, there was two conditions for recognition of Israel in 1947. Yes, one is to accept 194 resolution, the return back of the Palestinian refugees. The second, to accept or to recognize the Arab state, the Palestinian state. Unfortunately, the Palestinians didn't accept this partition decision. Yes, but we are now, we put on the table five core issues, and the Israelis negotiated with us these five core issues. One of them, and the important two of them, is refugees, Jerusalem, security, borders, and water, other.
So, Einat, I just want to get your reaction to that point, which is that, as Ashraf says, if Palestinians are different and that they don't have a sort of official home state, and this move, at least in the U.S. eyes, sort of cancels refugee status for millions of Palestinians, what do those Palestinians become? To where do they belong, do you think, in the eyes of the U.S. or of Israel?
So first we need to understand the history, that the reason that the Palestinians are refugees is precisely because they rejected having a state of their own on half of the land.
But let's speak practically now.
Well, this is the issue, because they say this war is still over. Had they accepted a state, they would not be refugees. But today, we need to understand, we need to understand that today, they actually live in place. 80% of those registered by UNRWA as so-called refugees, 40% live in Jordan. They are citizens of Jordan. They have no need to go anywhere. They are citizens of Jordan 4 or 5 generations by now. They don't live in the camps anymore. Those in the West Bank and Gaza will stay in the West Bank and Gaza. Their future is in the West Bank and Gaza. The day that the Palestinian leadership says, enough, we will build our future in a state in the West Bank and Gaza, but we have no demand to settle within Israel, is the day that they're done. The people stay in place, build their future in place, and there's no issue. They don't need to go anywhere.
I think there are here are two mistaken things. One is the role of United Nations, the UNRWA. The role is not political role. They don't intervene any of political process. They just give the refugees relief and give them work.
Let me let you continue.
And the second thing is no one, no party, even the United States of America or Israel, can remove this issue from the table of the negotiation.
The issue of what? Of right of return?
Refugees.
And that's how you interpret it. The U.S. is trying to take that issue away.
The Palestinians are very flexible in this issue, how to solve this problem. And we accepted the criteria of Clinton and Taba talks, after Camp David and Taba talks. And we have the 4 options for solving this problem. One is returning back to the Palestinian state, independent state. Second, to state where they are now and to have citizenship and equal rights. Third, to choose third country to go to.
A quick follow-up.
Fourth, and to return back to Israel. And the Arab Peace Initiative also give the Israelis veto to accept or not accept the number of the Palestinians to return back.
You previously said, though, that UNRWA is not political, that it has no political goals. But if for you, if the role is to assert the right of return, isn't that a political issue?
Yes, the right of return is a political issue. The UNRWA is existed because there is a problem of the refugees. Until this problem will be solved, the UNRWA will remain there in these camps and there where the Palestinian refugees are existed now. But no one can remove it. And if there is a problem of supporting, financing, I think other countries from Europe and other places, they can also replace the United States of America.
And I don't want you to respond to those points, but I'd also, there are those in the Israeli security establishment even that would say, that have said, they agree with all your criticisms of UNRWA, but this is not the way to go about reforming, just suddenly cutting off the funding with no alternative in place, and at a time when Palestinians such as Ashraf interpret it as a U.S. move to pressure them to accept this so-called Trump peace plan.
So I have deep dispute with the Israeli security establishment. They have been holding this position for 50 years, always saying now is not the time to move. So it is long due to move on this issue. We have suffered for 70 years when this issue has just ballooned, and when the Palestinians continue to live under the delusion that the world supports them in this demand. And we have heard here several falsehoods. UNRWA is the primary political organization of the Palestinians because it gives them the sense that the international community is with them with this so-called right of return. But in international law, there is no such thing as a right to return, and the Palestinians do not possess it as well. Also, no Palestinian leader has ever agreed to give up on the right. They sometimes are willing to negotiate practicalities, but they are never willing to forgo it as a right, which they call as holy, belongs to every individual Palestinian in perpetuity. So for them, even if Israel agrees to take a certain number, it is not the end of the issue. They have never agreed to sign any agreement that will state that it's the end of claims, that they have no demand to settle within Israel. You don't have that.
In all negotiations, the Palestinian leadership accepted the principle that when we reach an agreement, permanent settlement for the issue. There is the end. There is the end of the Palestinian demands. It is not.
That has never been the case. Find me a single Palestinian leader, because we negotiate practicalities, but there's never been a single Palestinian leader who had the courage to say, "Dear Palestinians, we will fight to have a state. We have the right," which they do, the right of every peoples to a sovereign state. We do not have the right to settle within the sovereign state of Israel.
We're running out of time, so I just want to give you a final thought.
We don't speak about the ending of Israel. We want to live in peace side by side. We want an independent state alongside in Israel. We want our rights, and the right of return is one of our rights.
It's not.
On this, we have to
issue.
It is in the United Nations.
As long as they will continue to think it's a right,
we have to stop here. We have to stop here, but here we arrive to one of the real nerves of this issue, and that is exactly why UNRWA and the cuts is striking such a nerve.